The 2020 Florida Prize has been postponed for 1 year due to the coronavirus pandemic. In anticipation of that exhibition, we're doing virtual studio visits with each of the artists. And today, we're going to be talking to Richard Heipp. My name is Hansen Mulford. I'm the curator at the Orlando Museum of Art.
And I'm Coralie Claeysen-Gleyzon, associate curator at the Orlando Museum of Art. Hi, Richard.
Hi, how are you doing?
Great to see you today.
It's nice to talk to real people.
What we're looking at is actually a painting of a photograph you took of a photograph in a museum.
Right. I'm interested in how the museum actually kind of affects the way we see and read things. I think we in the, that kind of study this stuff and in the museum and the art world have a great acknowledgement of this. We know that display changes the way we kind of read them. Other people that just look at things in the museum, they just don't really understand how important that display and what happens in that structure kind of alters the meaning of the piece. Not always, but, kind of many times. And kind of neutralizes a lot of the work from whether it's an artifact or a high art piece that just turns into this big collection of stuff that's housed in the display. So I think that's interesting, and just, kind of thinking as an art educator about the contextualization and what it takes to kind of understand the meaning of work and how meaning is constructed to it. I think, and particularly in painting's case, to see it as something other than just its pictureness. Mm-hmm. That as the way we look at pictures, we see so many pictures that I think reduces everything to a certain kind of sameness to it. A picture is a painting can be a picture, but then in my case, I'm working diligently to kind of create an illusion. It's a very kind of loving copy of a photograph that I try very hard to kind of look like a photograph. So I think on initial examination, a lot of these pieces, and I've even been in exhibitions where a critic will be reviewing them and, reviewed them as photographs instead of paintings. In one sense, that means it's working, what I'm trying to do, but in another sense, then they don't quite understand what I'm trying to do at the same time.
You actually want people to eventually recognize that they are paintings. By looking carefully at them, that sort of reveals itself subtly.
In this case, and this particular image that we're looking at, there's the spatial illusion of the photograph itself, but then there are also certain irregularities in the surface of the photograph that I'm painting, right. Whether it's these little reflections across the top, or if you can see where my cursor is, these stains on the photograph. Sometimes there are hairs in the photograph. Sometimes there are tears in the photograph.
Do you only use airbrush techniques within the work, or do you sometimes use other? Okay, it's all airbrush.
It's all airbrush. I have done, in other work that I've done, earlier work that's much more kind of collage-based looking, I would use a paintbrush and use other kinds of things. I was at a summer scholarship program at Kent State, the Blossom Summer Arts program, where they invited 6 different artists in for a week each. And one of the artists was Don Eddy, who was a photorealist airbrush painter. And he said, well, why don't you just use an airbrush? And I said, I don't know what they are. I don't know how they work. And he said, you buy one, hook it up to the compressor, you pour paint in, you point it at the canvas, and the rest is practice. And, it's been a long time since I've been doing kind of airbrush paintings then, but initially it was my naivete of not knowing what it was, and the kind of fascination with what a photograph looks like. And then, the photograph being able to freeze time in a way that prior to mechanical reproduction could never be done. That it could freeze, kind of depth of field, that it had its own particular language to it. Almost everything I do, there is some kind of reference to the uniqueness of what a photograph can do that our eyes don't do. This one, just kind of thinking about what it would be like to paint all that hair and all these little baubles. And this particular one, you know, just becomes like a jewel box of things. And a lot of this stuff is just plastic baubles and glass, you know, baubles in the way that this is made, and rubber, but it turns into this other kind of thing for it. So that's the finished painting. And then it goes through a sequence of just building. So every couple of days, I just photographed it with my cell phone and then kind of put it together. So it jumps around a little bit, but you get an idea how the, you know, kind of how the painting kind of comes together.
Gosh.
It's great.
And seeing it in the studio just really gives us a sense of scale as well, you know?
Yeah.
Is there anything that you've ever thought was a particular challenge, something that you were stuck, you weren't able to paint? Because it seems incredible that you can paint almost anything, the hardest, you know, the most difficult strands of hair or reflections you can master beautifully. Is there anything that you ever thought, my goodness, you know, that said, I'm stuck, I cannot do this?
Not recently, I'd say within the last 20 or 30 years, because in a way, everything is exactly the same to paint when you're painting from a photograph. I'm just copying it, right? And the things that seem like they're going to be the hardest things to paint, sometimes are the easiest things to paint. The hardest things for me to paint are a sharp straight line like this. I don't do any masking in my process. Some airbrush painters use a mask to do that. So I have to paint back and forth very carefully along like a line like this to get a sharp edge. And the straighter the line, the harder it is. I said that's more difficult, but it's not, you know, I don't necessarily look at that and say that's going to be hard. And sometimes a blur can be more difficult than this kind of articulation of the surface of this tabletop. Because there are some things that in terms of our vision that we'll just accept. You know, we don't necessarily question about whether each of these little things is in the right place. But believe it or not, a blur is fairly precise. I think when you see the original source and then see the paintings are not necessarily warm in terms of hue, but warm in terms of the motionality to it. And the photograph itself can be kind of cold to it. And some of that comes from, I can only make so sharp of a line with an airbrush. So they all get a little bit softer. So that and emotionally has that kind of tone to it. I pick source material that I think will make a good painting, because not every photograph makes a good painting for me. It has to have certain things that will translate because of my process. This one, you can see there's not much color added to it yet. I'm really working in this case with kind of two underpainting colors. One is this kind of very cool purpley brown, and the other is this red kind of purpley brown. You can see in this one, I've started to add more of this red color into it. And then some of this green color. And then as I begin to add, there's still not a lot of other kind of chroma going on here. And I reach a point then where I start glazing more and putting more pigments into it. You know, I do kind of work this way, but it's a matter of efficiency. So I'm also can, you know, kind of sit in one spot for days to paint this. But then, for example, where I get to painting the top of this up here, in my studio, I actually hang the painting upside down. This is an area you can really see where this is painted very monochromatically first. It's all painted in this kind of cool brown color first as an underpainting. And then as I start glazing the color on top of it, I'm glazing these reds, I'm glazing this greens, I'm glazing some of the yellows in here. And then eventually it gets to kind of full color. That's the same procedure I use for everything that I do.
So do you teach airbrushing techniques to your students?
You know, I actually don't teach airbrush technique. I've given a couple of workshops in it. What I actually teach, and I think I'd say I'm kind of known for teaching, is very traditional painting, you know, figure painting from life. Too often, I think with photo-based painting, there's too much emphasis that's just placed on the technique itself. You know, I think in some cases there's a dependency on the technique to make it good.
Sure. Yeah.
And,
well, but I think it's interesting that you're teaching, you know, figurative painting in the kind of a classical mode, which, you know, along with drawing, is really a craft that you learn, sort of a way of learning to play the instrument.
yeah.
But, you know, in your work, the craft carries a lot of the meaning of the work. If you didn't have the craft part down, it would fail.
Right.
If your technique were not good.
When the craft is wrong, and I will tell my students about this, and when the drawing is wrong in particular, I make an analogy to, it's like a word that's misspelled.
Mm-hmm.
You can be conscious of what the word is, and there are occasions, you know, like with E.E. Cummings, where you would purposefully misspell something that has meaning to it. But when it's just wrong, that's one of the things that you notice, that it's wrong instead of that it's right. And, you know, in a traditional academic figure painting class, that's exactly what I tell the students. I tell the students, we are not making art, we're doing exercises. And in the way that I'm teaching it, this is like a musician learning scales. This is like a weightlifter, you know, a sports person training. This is about learning, not necessarily the way, but a way to do it. And then you can reject it. It's not that you can't do it, it's that you choose not to do it. And I think that's an important part of it. Yeah. The way that I work has just become so much a part of how I think. And it's important that these paintings are airbrushed, that now has an analogy to an inkjet printer, you know, which is a mechanical paint spray, tiny little mechanical paint sprayer to it. So it's interesting that's kind of come full circle. But again, in terms of my selecting the pieces, I select pieces that I think will make good airbrush paintings.
Well, thank you, Richard, for talking with us today. And we're going to look forward to what you've been going to do in the next year before the show opens in 2021.
Yes.
Well, sure, I'll have a whole batch of new stuff for you to look at by then.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Richard.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for including me in the show. I appreciate it.